Hey, everybody. I am joined once again by Scott Church, and we're here to talk dead CCGs, vintage CCGs, everything under the sun. Scott, I kind of understand. I think it'd be a fun way to start the conversation that you've moved into some new space. You're growing the business, which I think is a good sign for all of these out of print card games. So,
Yeah,
what's the deal there?
yeah, Matt. Thank you very much for having me back on. I'm excited to be on again, and thanks for watching, everybody, and for tuning in. We got a new office space. It basically over doubles the size of what we had previously. So now we have more. You see racks in the background here. We're able to add 4 more of these racks, as well as 2 more employee workstations. So on our busier days, we have 4 people in office here working, pulling orders, sorting, scanning images, adding new inventory on. And then we generally have about 2 people that are at home workers that kind of come and pick up stuff and sort it at home. So it's allowed us to expand out. And so, yeah, out of print CCGs are doing well. Current CCGs are doing well. I'm looking at maybe picking up an office space, not an office, a retail space in one of the surrounding cities to where we're at that I think has a lot of potential for growth.
Oh, cool.
And if I'm able to do that, then we're fully on board with Lorcana, and we'll carry a lot more Magic and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh if we go that route. If we don't, we'll just continue on with these out of print games. And I mean, they're doing really well for us. There's a lot of more expansion to be done. I know Jedi Knights is something where a lot of people have been requesting it lately, so we're looking at that. And there's a few other games, like I started on Dragon Ball Z, and really it became what's the saying where, like, when you have too much stuff, it becomes like too overwhelming to even get to it. I can't think of like what the kind of
It's
like
like the
expression.
tyranny of choice, right? If you just like, all right, which one of these 3 restaurants do you want to go to? It's easy to be like, all right, I'm going to go on to the 3. It's like, oh no, we have 25 choices, right? It's like now I
Yeah,
can't decide. So
I was starting to add the Dragon Ball Z game to the site, and I added the majority of sets and inventory we had. And I have a friend that I've gamed with for years that he brought over tubs, 2 full tubs full of Dragon Ball Z. And then he's like, hey, my buddy wants to sell his. So he brings over another tub. So I've got 3 tubs of Dragon Ball Z from Score, the game that went from like 2000 to 2003 or so. And it's so hard to sort because each card has a regular and unlimited version and then a foil of each. So there's 4 versions of each card. The set symbols are a little tough. So, like, I'm the only one that knows the difference between them all in the company. And so trying to train an employee on that is going to be
you
time
need like a
consuming.
magnifying glass sometimes as well. That's how I feel. I don't feel that old, but sometimes I'm looking at the cards, trying to look at the bottom right. I'm like, is that an R or is that like, what is the rarity there, the set? It's getting increasingly difficult. So I guess what's the total number of games that you guys are carrying right now?
We've got over 100 right now.
Ooh.
We've started to expand out, and carrying like Inquest magazines. Like, this is one of the Inquests. Like, I've got stacks of them here of Inquests. We started to add these, and it just hits that nostalgia feel for anyone that collected these card games, in the 90s and 2000s, to get old Scries, Inquests, and look back at these interviews with creators or designers, or even see deck profiles. It's been a really fun thing to kind of carry those and get people. It's fun to see them, getting them in and be like, oh, I remember this cover and what was in this. And then, like, seeing people pick them up, it just makes me happy to see that, because I'm like, oh, this is history. It's so
Yeah,
cool.
I've got a couple of those, and every time I flip to the Magic pricing guide, and you see Alpha was like you could buy a set of Alpha for like $1,200 or something in 1999. You're like, okay, let's not think about this.
Yeah.
Uh, so I guess I'm kind of curious. We're well out of COVID now. I think you have people returning to sort of normal routines, and I'm kind of curious what you think the status of people playing this, their engagement levels. I mean, I think for a while there, people were just saying, everyone's stuck at home. Once COVID's over, all these hobbies are going to kind of die out. But do you think that there's some longevity with a lot of the communities being built and, relationships? I mean, one thing I'll say is I didn't do any of this stuff before COVID, and I'm still carrying forward here. And it's like, it's not about collecting; it's the friends you make along the way or something.
Yeah.
It's like it's the people that keep me more engaged than it's just the product. So I'm curious what you're kind of seeing on your end, though.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, this is a community of of friends generally, as well as collectors and players. And that becomes a big part of it. There's new personalities that have come out of COVID within this gaming space, yourself being one of them. That people really enjoy hearing what you have to say and, the content you're providing. I mean, your recent video about Lord of the Rings Dex profiles. I mean, it's just so awesome to see. And getting this great content that many of us wish we had for years. Like when we were playing it, I would have loved to have had that available to me. And now, years out, we have it. And I'm like, sweet, I can now take that and apply it to playing online or build a deck in person. I mean, the person that you interviewed for that, he had all foils of his whole decks. And I was just like, oh, man, he's got some money in that. It was exciting to see. And I think people still want that as part of their life. It's that community. I look at like the X-Files trading card game or CCG. They've built a whole community of people that are making videos. They're just excited to play the game and talk about it. There's only 3 sets for that game. And yet they've got people that since COVID has happened are making like weekly videos and getting people interested in playing. And they've released the parts of the unreleased 4th set. They've released some of them and made them themselves with custom backs on them. And it's really cool to see that people are continuing to build and spread the enjoyment of these games with people that enjoyed them in the past and are getting them back into it. So, like for myself, I'm a few years away from having all my kids out of my house. And so that's weird to think that I'm going to, like, my oldest is gone. He's going to be a senior next year. So he's going to be gone. And I'm like, that's 1 kid down out of 3. And I'm not too far off where I'm like, what am I going to do with that extra time, that I'm putting into kids and in the evenings? That'll be really interesting to see. I think some of us are in different spots in our lives where either starting or ending with that. And we've had that time to be able to spend on it, or we will have that time. And so I think people are still enjoying these games, even though they're back at work to some degree, but it's that community that was built during that time and the personalities that have come along from it that people just really enjoy. And so it's really fun to see, continue to see that growth from it and that it didn't just shrink back.
Yeah, I also think there's something that people, when you kind of discover collecting, it's a bit of a disease almost. It never goes away, right? It's like always in your DNA a little bit, where you're always going to have that meditative feeling somewhat when you're putting a card into a binder and you're like, this set is complete. Like, then I'm going to stick this back on the shelf. And, a lot of people don't get that. Like, they don't know how it feels to have everything in the place that it should be in, right? It's like set 1, 120 cards complete. Like, that makes me feel calm.
Right.
In an otherwise chaotic environment, right? It's like, okay, this little collecting thing, being excited about the mail. That's one thing that I'll say about all these games. I've gotten excited about the mail for the first time in years, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think there's just something, there is longevity in the enjoyment you get from collecting and trading and community. But I guess one of the other things that I've we chatted about this a little bit before, but, so I think the initial wave, you had a couple games that got real COVID bumps, like, Star Wars CCG, and Lord of the Rings was a little bit later, right? And then I think Harry Potter TCG kind of exploded and it's kind of maybe creeping back a little bit. But it seems like Jedi Knights and the Wizards of the Coast Star Wars TCG, right, are really blown up now, which is curious because I think you could have bought Jedi Knights for like a 1,000 box for $50 or something now, and it seems like people are kind of getting back into it. So it's interesting. I'm wondering if you can comment on that, like this new wave of kind of dead games that are becoming popular.
Well, I think you continue to see, you've got a lot of these Kickstarter games that are coming out, and it seems like some of them are really good. There's one that's like based off of the Naruto card game, and I guess that's pretty popular. But you see like Final Fantasy Flight, the company Fantasy Flight's going to release this new Star Wars game. And you look at the artwork that they've shown so far for it, and I'm like, it looks terrible. It's going to have dice again. And I'm like, Jedi Knights made in 2000 CGI, whatever version of Apple,
It looks like a video game, though. It's a little fun, right? It looks like an N64 game versus the Fantasy Flight one. And I'm not even sure if it has dice. I might have misspoke with that. But regardless, it feels like Fantasy Flight is just not a great company. Like Destiny was a bit of a mess, man. Like, I got rid of all my Destiny stuff, and I was like happy to get rid of 2,000 dice, or wasn't that many. But it just, And it seems like they're making similar mistakes. The art, we just did a video on this, and I did a little more looking into the new Star Wars game. I was like, this is pretty underwhelming. This is
Right.
a pretty ugly product.
Well, a big part of it too is, I think the Star Wars trading card game was always underrated because Decipher fanboys like myself, were upset that they lost the license. Wizards of the Coast took it, and we're like, oh, we'll never touch that. But when if you actually go and look at it, the cards are beautiful, and they use stills that aren't used in any of the Decipher games on some of the images. And so if you want to get a card signed, it's something different. There's a lot of, there's like 8 different maces and they're not all rare. There's 8 different Padmes. They're not all rare. So it's easier to pick these cards up that you maybe never had before. And they look great for signatures too. There's a lot of signature seekers. There's collection seekers, it adds something new to these games that you might not have had before in just collecting, just Decipher only. So if you're a Star Wars fan and you're like, oh, like, look at this Ozzel image. This is cool because we only have one image of Ozzel and Decipher, and yet we have multiple now in this other game. That's really cool to see.
Right. And I think there's also something said about the price there, right? As Star Wars TCG has gotten, I still think it's a pretty affordable game unless you're out to collect the ultra rare stuff. Like most rares are $1 or $2 or $3, right? It's still pretty affordable. But I do think that there's people that look at this and like, holy crap, a box of Reflections 3 is 4K, and they get scared off, right? Rather than realizing you can buy a set, now Premiere for probably $150, which is cheaper than it was 20 years ago, probably, looking at the Scry magazine. But I think there is a little people that get a little daunted, and they look at something like Star Wars TCG or some of these other games like, oh, this is cheap. Let me just dive in here. This feels easier to navigate than, a little bit more of an established market that has these singles that go for $50-$60, right? Because I think that can be a little daunting for new folks.
Yeah. I mean, like Young Jedi, I just bought someone's collection of Young Jedi. It's 5 of every card except for foils. And I did that because some of our Young Jedi is really thinned out, but it has all the Reflections dual cards as part of the collection. And, I'm really excited to add that because those have become extremely scarce to find. Prices have really jumped on them. They used to be, $4 or $5, and they're now $35-$40 each. Some of them are still in that like $10 range, but some of the harder to find ones or, more useful ones have really jumped. And I can't imagine they're going to go back down because anything Star Wars related generally has a huge collector base. It'll just keep bumping it up.
Yeah.
So things like Jedi Knights, where I need to get it on the site. That's kind of my plan this summer is Jedi Knights will get on, a few other games that we're working on. But anything Star Wars related is always going to do well. The other big game that we've seen a huge bump in is Overpower. That's a 90s version of Marvel, DC, and Image superhero games. People collect it just as they collected Marvel cards. So there's a collector base of just collecting superhero cards. There's a collector base to be able to play it or put together a set. Or you like characters. Like people will buy all of Juggernaut. I have a Juggernaut collector. He buys all the Juggernaut cards. I have a Jean Grey collector. They buy all Jean Grey. Iceman. Anyways, so there's things like that where games like Overpower have seen a jump. Verse is always doing well. These superhero related games. If I could get the Wildstorm game, the Jim Lee one, to bump up, I'd love to see that. That's a pretty cool game, and the artwork's amazing. But it just doesn't have the same love as these other Marvel-based ones.
So I guess one thing I'm kind of curious about, because there's no way to track this data, right? You can look at the Facebook groups; they gain more members, but you're like, okay, is that real? But are you seeing like new accounts being formed pretty regularly? Like, you have new people that create an account for the purpose of buying a game, right? Is that like a pretty regular occurrence on the site?
Yeah, it is. So about 40% of our orders are new customers and 60% returning customers. Like we had one person that they started buying Verse from us in January of this year. And I think they've placed about 20 to 30 orders so far just since January, where they found us and they're like, hey, I can finally start filling in these gaps in my collection. And they're just buying a ton of it. And they just love it. I had another guy, he was in South Africa. He's a lawyer in South Africa. And he wanted to finish off his Verse collection that he was buying in the mid 2000s. And so he spent a lot of money not only to buy the missing cards, but then to have it shipped to him in multiple shipments, safely and securely. And it was really cool to see him. He was so happy about it. And I'm like, when's the last time this guy had so much joy picking up cards? Like I love seeing stuff like that.
Well, that's why, I like chatting with you, Scott, because you're providing really the only marketplace, and sometimes you're the market maker. I see this all the time in groups, right, where it's like, what's the cost of a foil Balrog? And I was like, well, category 1 is it listed for 30, but it's sold out, so that means it's 50. And I think too many people think that you're working it with like 200 staff and like scouring the internet for. It's like, guys, they have like 100,000 different products listed on this website. I mean, I don't know if I'm exaggerating here, perhaps a little bit, but to think that there's like this price guide, because I think that's what so many people are searching out with this stuff. It's like, what's the price guide? Okay, here's the price guide. According to category 1 games, my collection's worth $10,000. I want $10,000. Like, well, good luck. No one's going to, because, so I just think that there's this, as these games grow and more people come in, there's this need for structure, right, that they're accustomed to in more robust marketplaces, whether it's, TCG Player, right? Any Magic card, you can go look it up. It's worth a penny, it's whatever. But with these games, it's still, there's no price guide that exists besides memory and eBay. And we've done a little bit of that with Star Wars. And a couple of people asked me, hey, can we do these market videos for Lord of the Rings? I'm like, Lord of the Rings on eBay is such a mess, right?
Yeah.
You don't really have robust resellers. You don't have, it's just kind of chaos, despite more of it being printed arguably than even Star Wars. Like, that's the thing I'll say about Lord of the Rings. Like, I think they've seen some price bumps there, but that stuff was widely printed. It was printed like, you probably have a million, not a million, I think you have 250,000 fellowship boxes that were printed. It's a lot of cards out there.
Right. Well, and then take set 5, what is that? Battle of Helm's Deep. They started printing those in Target. They released them in Target and Walmart too. So, they did a second printing of that basically to fill that side of it, the big box stores. So,
Right.
I mean, it's not like there's a lack of it. There's a lack of set 3, Realms of the Elf Lords, for whatever reason, seems like underprinted. And so does Return of the King for whatever reason. But the rest of it is so readily available. And then foils from set 8 and 10, Decipher was selling off. Well, by the end of it, there are so many 8 and 10 uncut sheets that were cut and just sat in a warehouse for a long time, and now are out. Like, there's one store that has basically an unlimited supply of set 8 and 10 foils. So those have kind of a set market price for them. But you mentioned that Balrog, I had it at $20 or $30, and someone was like, well, this sold recently on eBay for 100. And someone said they had a graded one that was 9 or 9.5 for 130. And it's like, well, what is the price of this? Right now, Lord of the Rings foils are so volatile. It's like watching crypto, where you're like, one day it's going to be $100, and then the next person that tries to sell it might be 60 or 50. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that's the result of two things, right? Like a low market, like a small market, right? Where there's truly, like, for me, I'm finishing out some Lord of the Rings foil sets, and I have 30 foils needed for Fellowship, and I'm just looking, I'm like, well, I need these 30 foils. To anyone else, these foils might be worth $1, but to me, I'm like, well, I value them highly because they're the last 30 I need. And I think there's a lot of people in similar cases like that. They need a couple cards to complete sets. And otherwise, these aren't super valuable cards to the everyday person. So it's a small market. And then 2, there's also, I think, a general aversion towards auctions. Everybody is afraid. Do you want to sell your stuff? Just put it on eBay, 99-cent auction, post it to whatever, Facebook or Discord, and just say hey, everything starts at $1, bid it up to that. That's the way to find market price. But everyone's scared of that. No one actually wants to do that because they're like, no, I don't want to pay eBay fees. I'm like, guys, you want eBay prices, but you don't pay eBay fees. You're
right. Anyway. People want the full amount without having to do the actual work, right? That's kind of an interesting thing where they're like, well, it's worth this, and I'll sell it for 10% under because that's the eBay fees. And it's like, yeah, but you're also reducing the amount of time you're having to put into this over the process as well. So you got to kind of factor that in. You mentioned there's always usually 1 or 2 whales, I would say, that are looking to finish off collections, and they'll overpay for things. you've
Sure.
had Andy on, so I don't think he's going to mind me saying this, but he by himself has influenced Star Wars, like higher end, hard to find items value just because he wanted it, and so he was willing to overpay for it versus anyone else. And then once he kind of stepped back, you kind of see a drop in that value once that guy that's kind of the whale coming after it, steps away from it. And each game has an equilibrium point, right? So there might be 3 people looking for that Balrog foil from Mines of Moria, and once they've finished it, that price is going to drop because the third person looking for it is like, if I get it, whatever, for $30, I'm happy. So, I mean, that's what's hard about pricing all this. Like, when we get in foils, a better rare foil, we'll go look and see what eBay sold has recently done and kind of average it out. Or if there's not sold, we guesstimate on it. Jedi Knights, for example, when we add that, there's no sales data on Jedi Knight singles. It's not like you said, there's no marketplace where we can go to and say, hey, here's what these are selling for. So we're kind of like, all right, here's the quantity we have from the collections we bought over the years. Here's what we think it's going for. It's good play wise. It has a collectability to it. Oh, it's a FET. That'll be a little more than, say, an interrupt type of action, or action. So there's a lot of guesswork when it comes to things like this. And so it's not, it's not like we have hard data with it. So when like this whole Balrog, I posted, I actually have one from a collection I bought recently. I didn't even know it was in there, and I was flipping through and I was like, oh, here's the Balrog everybody's talking about. So when we go to list it, we'll probably put it at $80-$90 in near mint. And my feeling always is leave the extra 10% for the next person, or be lower, so that way people wants to keep shopping with us. We want to keep our customers happy too. So we don't want to like maximize the value on it where people come and they're like, well, they're a ripoff, so I only come to them X, Y, and Z. I'm not trying to, we're not trying to do that to people. We want people coming back and enjoying their hobby. So we're not going to market at the most, the highest price possible.
Yeah, I think what you're describing happened a little bit with Star Wars CCG and Japanese Hoth, where there was a couple of these eye-popping single sales for, Japanese red cards, Meteor Impact, I think was one, or
right,
Gaggle or something. And, people were paying like $1,300 because they had one card they needed. There's maybe 4 or 5 guys that had one card they needed for their set, and then they complete the set. And then I think a lot of people came up later and like, oh, I'm selling a similar Hoth red card, $1,700. People like, no, I don't want that, right? That was a one-time thing.
Right.
It didn't really establish the value. It's just a few people were chasing that. And that's the problem with these really small markets, is they can kind of be manipulated easily. I don't want to say Andy's manipulating anything, but he wanted to buy some high-end stuff, and he bought his high-end stuff. And now people look at the price memory and say, oh, well, X person bought it for $400. So I'm going to sell it for $350, and it's a deal. It's like, well, actually, no one's going to pay $350, and you're going to sit on this stuff for a long time. And so I think it's a really fascinating little space to be in. But I think one thing that any dead CCG desperately needs is also that engagement, right? You need to have people, whether it's playing or collecting, celebrating completions or trades, because there's not new sets coming out. There's no drum beat, right? With current games like Magic, you have a drum beat. I think with Magic, I would argue the drum beat's a little too aggressive, right? Where it's new set every 3 months, new commander decks to buy every 3 months. So it's a little too much. But with this stuff, you got to keep people engaged, interested, the conversation flowing. And it's hard to keep a conversation flowing when it's not a print for 25 years. So
right. And there's like a velocity you want to have with all this too, right? So like, we can get when we get new Star Wars stuff in, it sells really quickly. People love Star Wars, but there's games like Legends of the Burning Sands. I'm gonna throw this game under the bus here.
Let's go.
We added it, and some of those sets are really hard to find. There's only a few sets for the game. The last set was basically destroyed by the company because they overprinted it. No one bought it, so finding it's really tough. So we price stuff, I think, too high at first, and then we've slashed the prices over time. But there's very few people looking for it. Every once in a while, we sell promos or a few of the higher-end rares, but it doesn't have much sales velocity. To me, I'd rather price it a little bit lower and have it continually moving in and out, people selling to us, as well as people buying it, than I would just pricing it at a high amount, hoping, waiting for it to sell and not having a lot of interest in it.
Yeah,
So,
ultimately, that's what feels to me like a healthy game. We're talking out of print stuff, so it's like, what is healthy? It's not being printed, obviously, so it failed. But to me, volume of sales is way more interesting because it's both people entering and leaving the game, right, or whatever it is. But that is way more healthy to have that velocity in sales and just like I have this Conan CCG. I did a couple of videos on it. It's a cool game. Jason Robinette, who's the sort of game creator, sort of a friend, and he's a cool guy, but it is like nobody is interested in it. Like it's interesting, it's expensive because it was printed for like 6 months and half of it was destroyed.
Yep.
So it's expensive, but no one's really looking to buy it. So is it expensive, right?
Yeah. So that's the tough thing with how do you price something like that? How do you price sealed product for that where it's basically non-existent, but is there anyone really looking for it? I'll give you an example. I've got my computer on a stack of Verse system. We sell a lot of Verse system, and we love this community. I played the game when it was alive and active, and there's still a ton of people that play and collect it. But we get in a ton of Verse. I mean, we get in so much Verse, and we churn and move through a lot of Verse. And that's what I like to see from a game is that churning of in and out, because otherwise it just becomes stale and the cards aren't basically paying for their rent, for being here. So
Right.
like I love seeing Verse, and that puts a lot more manpower into having to sort and filter that and pull, but at the same time, like the community's active and they're just really into it. They love it. And that's what you like to see is a healthy community versus like there's 5 people that collect this, maybe one more guy will come along in a year that forgot he had it. It's like kind of interesting where you see that with some of these games. And anyways, like it's really fascinating. Like we're seeing a big turn with My Little Pony. I mean, My Little Pony sat dead on a shelf for a long time. And just in the past few months, probably because of you and a few others online that have been posting videos about it, as well as an active market now in China, I believe. People are really getting into the My Little Pony later sets. The earlier sets still super abundant, not that hard to find, but even the ultra rares from that, people have cleaned us out. And I mean, I haven't adjusted prices on that basically since I first put it on the site. And so those could have jumped a lot by now, but I just haven't, like you said, we aren't a million people sitting here being data analysts to analyze every game and see what's going on. There are games like we pay more attention to, like Verse System, but like My Little Pony, because it hasn't been active in a while, I've just kind of let it sit. And then we start having sales for it. I'm like, like what's going on here? And it's really interesting to see how that changes.
Well, and that's the other thing with all these games. It just takes one thing to catch fire, right? Like I guess maybe My Little Pony is having a moment in China. I have no idea, but
right.
It just takes one little community to say, like I think with Lord of the Rings TCG, they're kind of having this moment. Like I've been kind of collecting that stuff for like 2-3 years, and with the Magic set that's come out, that community is probably grown by, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 people. Are they all active? I don't know, but they just have new accounts coming in, and they're like looking to buy because they're like, oh, there's already a Lord of the Rings game. I did some light Googling and I came across this game instead, and this looks great. Why don't I collect this? This is interesting. And I mean, that's sort of one of the goals with this channel is I'm just trying to leave breadcrumbs for people. Like if you want to find these games, here is 100 hours of videos that you can watch at your leisure to figure out how to do it. But otherwise, I think that these games can have these little mini moments. And, I think Star Wars CCG right now that's sort of like my first love, right? But it seems to me like it's just sort of, it's stable, right? It's not plateauing, it's just stable, right? There's not a huge price fluctuation, just sort of moving forward. And I think that's good, right? I don't think you want things to always be increasing in price. That doesn't mean things are good because they're more expensive.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the challenge for me now is how do we make this, how do we make some of these games more accessible for new players? Like you guys are trying out in a few of your different videos, like you did Final Fantasy, trying out a starter deck. It looks like you released your Babylon 5 starter deck video where you're playing, how do we make this more accessible in these various games? So like we have so much leftover verse bulk. So what I'm doing is I'm sorting out teams, and I'm going to be starting to sell intro decks by different teams. So if you want to play Brotherhood, you want to play Avengers, you want to play X-Men, it'll be an intro deck for like $5-10. There'll be 60 cards that'll get you into play. And so that's what I really want to start doing for these different games. I know Middle Earth, they have like these intro decks on their Facebook page. They're supposed to be really good. They're competitive, and they only use commons and uncommons. It's like a popper type starter deck. And so people have been like pulling that list and going and buying the cards for it off my site. And a game like Middle Earth, it sells really well, and we don't have enough extra quantity where it's hard for us to like pull stuff aside to make decks for something like that. So that's going to be kind of my challenge moving forward, is figuring out how to make these games that are out of print where they watch one of your videos and they're like, hey, that looks fun. Let's head over to Category 1 games and pick up basic way on how to play, with a deck or two. And that's really kind of really what I want to focus on this summer, is kind of making a lot more intro stuff for new players as far as, decks available for them to buy.
I think that the challenging thing with that is these games are pretty complex sometimes, right? I was trying to do a Conan CCG how to play, and I was reading through the little rule book. I'm like, I can't even figure this out myself.
Yeah.
Right? Just, figuring it out in a vacuum. It's like some of this stuff can be pretty hard to sit there and do a how to play, especially, the modern attention span is not super long. So yeah, people don't want a 45-minute tutorial of you fumbling through cards and like the cameras resuming. They want like a snappy, how do I play in 10 minutes, right? Which is, right. I think, if you look at board game content on YouTube, that's what it is. It's like how to play Settlers of Catan in under 5 minutes, on how to do. Right. And these games don't lend themselves super well to that, because it's introducing so many concepts. It's like, well, you have light side and dark side, and you have locations, and you have characters, and you have weapons, and you have ships, and you have interrupts, and you have effects. And okay, hold on. It's like a lot of things to process.
So there's like this really great animated video for how to play Vampire the Eternal Struggle on YouTube. But the video is like 30 minutes, 30 minutes, I think. And I remember watching it, and there's up to a point where I'm like, okay, I get this. And then it got to a point where I'm like, oh man, there's just so much stuff here. It's like a fire hose, where I'm like, you'd almost have to go through and break it up into chunks and like kind of play with someone. And like, okay, we got this part. Now let's go on to the next phase. And I'm like, that just is not easy for someone to just pick up and start playing. And so I'm like, that's what happens when these games are made in the mid 90s. And that wasn't the intent. It was to provide like this experience while playing one game. When I think most of us think of like a 10-15 minute game is about where it should be.
Right. Well, I also think it was like this transition from, CCGs were just big board games, or like littler board games, or whatever. But, and I think that time has shown us that that's not the right formula, right? They don't actually, you don't need to build a universe with this. The universe is always going to be implied. Like with Magic, like you're a planeswalker or a sorcerer that's summoning to a plane. It doesn't really matter, right? You're putting out little monsters. You're battling your opponent's monsters, trying to get to zero. You don't need to world build too much, right? Yeah. But some of these other games, it's like almost too thematic, right?
Yeah.
That's a big deterrent for a lot of new folks. Is just like they can't get over the number of new concepts to learn, and it's like, I just want to play something with a buddy in 30 minutes. I actually, the Final Fantasy TCG the video I did, I would like to do a little bit more of that game. I just frankly don't have the physical space to do more.
Yeah.
It's like I don't have any more space in my house for new games, but would love to do. I'd also like to do a Young Jedi playthrough. I hear that's kind of fun and pretty simple. That's a game actually I'm pretty bullish on, and as well as the Final Fantasy TCG. I know it's a living game, but I think that's an interesting TCG, and just Square Enix could never get out of its own way. It seems like they just like hate that game, but they keep printing it for some reason.
Yeah,
it's very strange to have a company like support something and then like give it so little love.
Yeah. Well, you look at like Fantasy Flight, and I would say Final Fantasy, which is Square Enix, like they both like are doing more harm than good to their games, where it's almost like it shouldn't be that hard to be successful with the games that they have. Right. And they're just hurting themselves. It's like if they had anyone with half a clue kind of put in charge of these, like I'm a marketing person. their marketing for both is beyond terrible. Like they should get new marketing people. I can go off on Final Fantasy with like how poorly done release that was, where you have this active game and active players. It was a big card game in Japan. You know what you do with every like game you sell, physical copy or digital copy? You put an advertisement in there for your card game. Like Wizards of the Coast did that with the Transformers card game. They put in little they
Slip.
gave you like little tags like this in each of the Transformers TCG games. And half of them were blank on both sides, and then half of them had a printing saying like, "Hey, check out the new Magic set that's coming out," or "Check out the new Transformers, show on Netflix," or whatever it was. They were including an advertisement in it, and I'm like, how hard is that for Final Fantasy Square Enix to do that to support their own game? Like,
Right. I mean, they're about to come out with Final Fantasy 16. They're going to release, it's probably going to sell 10 million copies. You could have a little voucher, right? 10% off your first order. Check out, do you love these characters? Come play them, in this card game. Or you could even have an integrated every, mini game where it's hinting at this and there's a bigger universe. There's a bunch of things they could do. But I think ultimately in Square Enix's case, this is just a rounding error. They just don't care. They're a multinational.
right.
It's like this whole card game thing. It's whatever. It doesn't matter to them.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that would lead me to like kind of the thought process goes to Lorcana and seeing all the steps that they're taking so far with this release that Ravensburger is doing. It seems like they're really on top of it. They put out, here's some basic cards. People are already like printing out the cards and learning how to play. There's deck types already online. There's tons of content for it. There's tons of, we know what the play program is going to look like. We know what the starters and the packs are going to look like. They've already announced the second and third sets. They're really doing a launch, I think, correctly. Now, the thing is going to be is how many people are going to actually want to play it versus kids that just buy Pokemon because they love Pokemon and Disney fans that just want to buy it because they love Disney. So I even wonder how much the play will matter, but I know stores are like feasting on this. Like when I'm looking at adding a retail store, it's mainly because I think Lorcana is going to be really good and I want to be able to get into it from a distributor. But even distributors are saying they don't know how much they're going to fill.
I agree with everything. I mean, I think I did a video like 6 months ago, kind of, criticizing Ravensburger for how they're handling it. And I think it's much better now. Totally agree. However, there's this allocation question. Like you need to comfort folks to say that like you're really excited about our product. We always say at work, these are high quality problems to have. Like this is a great problem that people are excited about your stuff. However, you need to tell them that they're going to get their hands on it, right? This can't be Tickle Me Elmo, right? Level stuff where you have people paying 3 times retail on eBay to get this for their kids, because that's not a sustainable model, right? And I think that with D23, that's what kind of settled. And I also think those cards have kind of peaked, and I just don't think there's a lot of room to grow there. People kind of start getting to it. You reach this threshold with sales where is this an event of selling these cards that the IRS is starting to look at? It's like over $10,000. People start to be like, okay, hold on. You're transferring large sums of money. What's going on here? Is this a taxable event? And I think that sort of naturally hits the brakes on a lot of pricing because people, it just starts to get suspicious transferring $25,000 or something.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I think Lorcana is really interesting. I agree that the cards look great. I think they just got to figure out allocation. They got to, it shouldn't be hard to print this stuff.
Well, and, think about like people that collect card games like this. You're going to have Magic releasing this Middle Earth set that's going to take up a lot of people that don't normally spend money on Magic. Then you've got Lorcana coming right afterwards. That's a lot of people's money going into hobbies for just these 2 sets. What's that going to look like for anyone releasing a card game, September, October, November, December after them? It's like if you're Magic, do you just take off till February? Like, what's that look like?
Right. I mean, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if whatever set Wizards is releasing for Magic in the fall kind of dips down a little bit and isn't as popular. One interesting question for you, I guess, is, with these major IPs coming out, let's just say Lorcana, is going to take up a lot of people's money. I mean, I'm going to dip my toes in a little bit if I can find it for retail. Do you think that's going to have an impact on sort of the dead CCG market, right? Because it's all the same brained people, right?
Right.
instead of buying Versus, maybe we're going to buy Lorcana? Or do you think it's, different kinds of people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't know. I mean, there's a decent. We have a little questionnaire once people place orders. Is there any other games we should carry? And one of the questions a lot of people answer is, I only play this game, or they leave the response of I only play this game, or I play this game and one other, and so it's not always kind of the regulars that are buying current games. A lot of my customer base is really only buying these out of print games. Now, whether those two products get people back into stores and playing a live game is a whole nother question. So I don't know. I think it'll be really interesting to see if it does impact us and what that will look like. I would say if Disney and the company that owns Lord of the Rings, Amazon, whether it's Amazon or not, if they can kind of get their acts together and put out decent and good product, it drives interest in these other properties.
So I agree there. I think that the macro thing to be tracking is interest in hobbies, right?
Right.
And it's not like, there's only 100 gold coins that are going to be spent on hobbies, and now 70 gold coins are going to Lorcana and 30 are going to Magic, and that means it's that the pile of gold coins is going to grow, right? And that more people are interested. You have kids coming in, you have parents that are going to be looking at cards for the first time, and they sit there and say like, oh, I used to collect this Lord of the Rings game 20 years ago. I wonder whatever happened with that. And then they fall down an internet rabbit hole, and suddenly they're spending their kids' college fund on foil golems or whatever. But I think that that's to me like it's about growing the pool of people, not about like there's a finite number of resources that are going to be spent, right? I think that's at least my take on it.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. I've kind of thought about this and talked about this a little bit in my weekly newsletter that I send out. But the writer's strike, I think, will have a really interesting impact on, what happens with these shows. Like, I think the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power show by Amazon is still being made, even though the writer's strike is going on, if I'm not mistaken. And what happens with Star Wars properties with this writer's strike? And supposedly, a lot of people think it'll end after summer. But who knows, and I think there's other writers guilds are going to go on strike, including the movie studio writers guild and a few other different people within those industries. So what happens if there's a stop to new development on this stuff for a year or two because of this strike, or, it delays it or pushes it back that much further? And then people are just kind of like, hey, I like those card games, or take, for example, Michael Barr owns Desert Sky Games in Arizona. He puts out a great blog every week or every couple days. And one of the things he talks about is a breakdown of people's expendable income to things like hobbies. And generally it's about 5% of their expendable income goes to their hobbies. So that's going to be like, TV, movie, music, that sort of thing. And a lot of that just
or whatever it is, the fun stuff.
Fun. So, I was looking, my daughter wanted to go to a movie last night with some friends, and she looks on it and it's like Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And the movies were either like not something she'd be interested in. There's just nothing new out where a teenager even wants to go spend their money on it. So then she's like looking to see where they can go with friends to go spend their money. So they eventually ended up at laser tag in the arcade. Okay, it sounds like an 80s event versus like 2023, right? So it's crazy to see like movies. There's not anything really good coming out that people are interested in. So they're putting more money into things like this with their expendable income, where they know it's going to be something they really enjoy and get a result from, that they're going to really love, getting that package in the mail, seeing the cards, feeling it. There's a whole thing to it that you don't get out of, say, like going to a movie even.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to delve too deep into my thoughts on the cowardice around adopting new IP, but I think studios were addicted to sequels for a long time. Yeah. I mean, I like John Wick. Did we need 4 of them?
Right.
I don't know, right? Like, I think that there was this penchant for going towards playing the hits rather than trying to develop anything original, which is why you have 10 Star Wars spinoffs. Yeah, it's a great franchise. But there's a fear away from breaking the mold. Even with the Star Wars shows, you think about people talking about Andor like it's like revolutionary just because it's like PG-13, right? Essentially. But people are like, Andor is so different. I'm like, is it? Right? Like, it's just a slightly darker take. It's like the Logan in X-Men, right? It's like that's what Andor is.
Yeah.
But I think in general, like there wasn't this interest in ever developing new IP over the last 7 to 10 years because you had some big, huge flops. Like I think one was Jupiter Rising, right? There was like a $200 million movie. Like,
Yeah.
some real nasty things that happened in like the 2000s with IP, and so now the studios are taking the position like, let's just play the hits. Do we have another Viking show? Okay, do we have another show on Star Wars? Do we have a Lord of the Rings one? Marvel show 250, and this stuff is good. And like I think like there's some really interesting content coming out of it. But in general, I think we're seeing the results of decisions made 5 years ago to not put out new ideas. Right. Anyways, that's my I could go on for a long time there about how I feel we live in a kind of cramped media space that doesn't have enough originality in it. And that's why when you see like anything that's even burgeoning on original, people are like freaking out like, my God, Andor, it's like a spy thriller. It's like he's like Jason Bourne. Wow, this is so cool.
Yeah, it's true. I think we're like really wanting something. Well, I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see, and I think that's why a lot of us still go back to the games we love, though, is it's that comfort and we know it's successful and we know we're going to like it. Why do I continue to buy X-Men books even though I actually haven't flipped one open and read it in a long time? I'm just used to buying it, and it's a comfort because I'm like, oh, it's X-Men. I know these characters. I can pick it up and enjoy it. Whereas I'm sure there's other great new books out, but I just don't pick them up to read them because it's something
it's like comfort food, right?
Yeah,
you want to go to your like your ice cream, your favorite ice cream. You don't want to try the new one out,
right?
Yeah. Well, I think we're hitting almost 50 minutes here, Scott. So I think if whoever's still with us, we appreciate you listening to us chat. I'm going to try to sit down with Scott once every 6 months or so, just do a sort of a seasonal check-in. I'm really excited that you got this new store going. Hopefully you get a retail store. Maybe I'll make a road trip out there. It's kind of far, I think, to drive, but would love to see the retail space if that gets up and running. So really happy for you there, Scott. Any kind of final thoughts here?
No, just keep playing the games you guys love. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Find these hobbies, enjoy them, and keep watching Matt's stuff. He's providing great content with these games, and he's showing you how to play some of these and making your games better, how you play better. I think it's really helpful. So thank you for doing it. And thanks everybody for tuning in and watching and supporting us and helping us grow. I mean, Category 1 games couldn't grow like this unless we had a great customer base that's worldwide. I mean, it's really awesome to see, and we love it. We really enjoy our customers, and thank you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And one, just a little addendum there, I love doing the how to play stuff and how to utilize this, but there's also something you said about how to collect it, right? I think too often players look at the collectors like they're these like, Smaug sitting on their piles of cards. It's like, guys, we can all coexist peacefully together. You can play a game, you can collect a game. There are broader things at work that are driving up prices or causing scarcity than just like one guy. So yeah. I think that it's also collecting is really meditative, and people that kind of find that it is nice to just get in that mindset and enjoy products, whether it's just looking at them in a binder or, trading with your friends or you're actually getting a game together. So thanks so much for chatting, Scott. Happy playing, happy collecting, everybody. And please like, subscribe, check out Scott's channel, Category 1 Games. He's got kind of weekly stuff going through some Scry and Inquest, talking about games. So check out his site. I'll leave a link in the video description. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time.